And that was Feist singing Sea Lion Woman. And today we are talking about marine conservation, and I've just been going through a list of animals that are particularly threatened. Well, not just animals, but organisms in general. And the next on my list is marine birds. And what's funny is that many people don't think about birds as being marine animals because, of course, they do spend some time on the land as well. But there are many species that spend huge amounts of their time out on the water or over the water in the case of the albatross, or on little island habitats that are in the water, or coastal areas that are right next to the water. And so of course these animals are dependent on marine environments for most or all of the resources that they use, and in fact they contribute quite a lot to these environments as well. And seabirds are actually one of the best studied groups of all marine species. And sadly, the reward for this is knowing that about a third of these species are threatened, and 4 other species have recently gone extinct within the last 500 years. Now, birds, like corals, are particularly likely to be affected by multiple threats at the same time. And again, some of these are things we've already talked about, but others are a bit novel. So these guys are in trouble from mortality from fishing and oil spills and coastal development, but also from invasive species, and that's something I mentioned before, but in this case it's a bit different. So with these guys we've got invasive species that are on land, and in particular they have to deal with things that we've introduced. So things like cats and rats in particular. So rats are quite bad because they've been found to prey on about 25% of all seabirds. And you hear these estimates about how wherever you are at any given time there's a rat within 5 feet of you or something like that, which is probably not quite true, but it is accurate to say that we've taken rats pretty much everywhere that we've gone or gone past or even thought about going, and so these guys are everywhere, and that can be a real problem for seabirds. And some researchers have called invasive rats the single greatest threat to all seabirds. And these guys are quite clever, and they're nimble and they can get into places, and they can eat pretty much every life history stage that these birds will go through. They'll eat eggs, they'll eat chicks, and if they can manage it, they'll even eat adults. And this is particularly true when we're talking about bird species that have small adults. And these guys are often found on islands, and they can run completely rampant on islands, and they will just propagate and propagate and propagate until you have huge populations of rats that are very hard to get rid of. And as I said earlier, another big threat is cats, and again cats can go through all the different life history stages and eat things at pretty much every level. Now, birds also can be affected by ecotourism, and this is kind of a sad thing because we think of ecotourism often as being kind of a solution to the problem of how are we going to preserve our habitats but then also make them worth something, monetarily speaking. And the fact is that people going in can be quite stressful and cause changes in behavior, reduce the foraging efficiency or success of animals. It can also cause nest abandonment or reduce nesting success. And we know this to be the case for lots of different seabird species, things that range from penguins to wading birds to shorebirds to cliff nesting birds, pretty much the whole gambit. And this is quite bad for these guys because they are so popular, and birding is a really booming industry right now, and it's quite sad because also they have quite a lot of symbolic meaning for us, so the albatross in poetry and in literature, and they of course have big contributions to the habitat as well. So when you've got things like these large birds that go in and can eat a significant proportion of fish in any region, this can have a big impact on the habitat. Now, of all these guys that I've mentioned, maybe the most at-risk group is the marine turtles. And these guys, there are 7 species, and 6 of them have been well studied, and all of those 6 are threatened, and the remaining species is data deficient. So it's quite possible that if researchers were to go in and find out more information about that 7 species, it also would be threatened. And these guys, like the birds, are affected by threats at pretty much every stage of their life cycle, only in this case the threats are a bit different. So this starts off when they're eggs on the beaches, when you've got coastal development and predation, you've got activity by humans and also pollution. And then they become hatchlings, and again they have to deal with pollution and predation. And then once they become juveniles and adults, they might get caught accidentally or on purpose by fishermen. And so these guys are suffering quite a lot. And actually, if this is a topic that you are interested in, then I definitely will encourage you to go visit the University of Exeter's website, because we have some people here doing really great research on marine turtles, and we have a marine turtle specific research group that's been started up, and you can find out a whole lot about marine turtles around the world. And so I'll put that link on the Wildside website when I'm all done with this. Now that kind of is what we know for now about the species. As I said, researchers are going kind of back through the data in order to reevaluate all these different groups of species using the latest research. And they've worked their way through a good portion of animals, but there are others, not just animals, but other organisms as well, that they need to evaluate more in the future. And so as that information becomes available, I will post that on the website as well. Now, just from the things that I've gone through already, you might notice that there are some characteristics that are common to many of the species that are threatened. So many of them breed in the way that we breed. So they age and they grow quite slowly, and they might live for a pretty long time. They mature late in life, so they have several years early on when they're not breeding, which means that they're not contributing to the population and getting those population numbers up. And this causes them, also they might breed infrequently, or produce fewer young per breeding attempt, or both of these things. So again, this causes them to have quite slow population increases already, but then if you go in as humans and start taking them out, or taking out certain age classes that are particularly productive breeders, then this can depress that rate even more. Also problematic are the fact that you've got some species that have specializations that are associated with breeding. So some species will change their sex, and some species will aggregate in order to spawn. And so fishermen are attracted to aggregations because they can get a whole lot of fish at once. But that also means you're depleting a huge proportion of the population all in one go. And also with the sex change is quite interesting. Usually these things are instigated because the organisms will sense that there are a certain number of other individuals around them or not, and this causes them to undergo some sort of change in terms of their hormones and their morphology. And so if you take away individuals in the population and change those cues, then it might make them undergo sex changes or not when appropriate, and that then can affect who's available to do breeding. Now fishing, as I said, is particularly bad when it targets the critical age classes, or when it targets multiple age classes simultaneously, because this then can prevent populations from replenishing themselves. And that's Black Wave by the Shins. And before the break, I was just talking about characteristics that are common to many of the marine species that are currently threatened. And one of the other ones that I hadn't yet mentioned was being endemic or habitat restricted. And this makes animals particularly susceptible because they often tend to have quite small populations to begin with. They also might have very specific habitat requirements. And also it's very problematic when you join that together with having very little migration, because that means that they're already not really having a lot of gene flow, which means they might not have a whole lot of variation and be able to adapt to the new environment. But also it's bad because it means that it's not going to be replenished by, if you have one little population that goes extinct, it's not going to be replenished by another one from the outside. Now in general, migrants can actually be in a lot of trouble, despite what I've just said, because when you're a migrant individual, you tend to use more habitats and more types of habitats, and you just cover more space. And all of that means that you're more likely to encounter disturbance of some type in some part of your range or another. And also, what's quite interesting with marine animals is that we have a lot of species that have migratory memory, and it's genetic. And so they just inherently know how to migrate, when to migrate, where to go, and they have a lot of cues that are programmed in. And if you wipe out populations, then you often will wipe out the whole memory of how to migrate. So even if you do have other populations that can come in and replenish a habitat where a species has gone locally extinct, those other individuals probably don't know how to then go about the regular migration as normal, which means that that information is gone forever. And that can have quite a huge impact on whether the population and the species then will continue to be successful. Another big issue with animals is when they have the propensity to be caught in fishing tackle. And this is something that we see in lots of different species, whether it's things that are coming up from the water or things that are coming in from outside. So, birds from the outside, turtles, fish, sharks, all sorts of different things that will get tangled in things. And also some of the birds just may be interested. They may see the bait down there and then not actually see the gear. And there are actually lots of species that can't see the gear very well because of the way it's designed and the way their sensory equipment is. And so any of these species that will get caught for whatever reason are in a lot of trouble, because often they'll drown before they can be rescued, or when they are rescued they're not treated very well by the fishermen, or they might be just, if it's a turtle, for instance, and you're a fisherman and you catch it by accident, you might think, well, this is actually a pretty good catch, I might as well keep it. So whatever the reason, that animal will often end up dying. And of course, being associated with coastal or near-shore habitats at some point in your life is not very good, because that means that you're going to be exposed to all this development that we humans are doing in those areas. And for any species, if you have a close relationship with another animal that's, or plant or whatever that's quite threatened, that's probably going to be bad for you, because if you depend on that for habitat or for food, then you may find yourself indirectly affected, even if you're not directly targeted by human disturbance. So given all of this depressing stuff that I've been talking about, what's the status of marine conservation right now? Well, unfortunately, like I said, there are species that are completely data deficient. And some of the conservation efforts are just proceeding basically on guesswork, because there just simply aren't enough data. And marine species are particularly underrepresented on lists of species that are assessed under red list criteria. So if you look at all the species in the world, terrestrial or not, the marine species are pretty neglected, really. And this is hard. It's hard to deal with these guys because they're far away, both horizontally and vertically. So how do we get to them? A lot of them move around a lot. They all look quite the same. It's hard to mark them. There are lots of problems that deal with how to study them very well and how to find them. And they also have some behaviors that are interesting in some respects, but then not in others. So researchers might think, well, I'm going to look at them in this particular setting and then not follow that up. So you might know about what happens when they migrate up into an estuary, for instance, but then you don't know what happens when they're out in the wide ocean, and that could be where the problem is. And so it's all about coming up with ways to study these things more reliably and more effectively and over a much larger scale. So there are lots of major goals in terms of making marine conservation a bit better, and also making it, applying it to more species that are in need. So first of all, we need to develop sustainable fishing practices and eliminate harmful harvesting. And this means we need to have more regulation, so for instance on the high seas as well as in national waters, but also we need to use better fishing technology. And there are lots of cool developments that people have come up with to make fishing better. It's just a matter of getting all of these tested and distributed to people, and making sure that it's going to be economically feasible to do this. We also need to slow down coastal development, or at the very least find ways to make it less destructive. So we need to reduce the runoff and the pollution that are associated with it, reduce coastal erosion, prevent the development of beaches, or at least the kind of combed, unnatural, hard beaches that we put in instead of the things that are there naturally with pebbles and rock pools and that sort of thing. Of course, we also need to slow or reverse climate change, which is something that's good for the whole globe and all of the species, not just for marine species. We need to reduce carbon uptake and therefore reduce acidification, and that's this is a portion of reducing climate change impacts. And also we need to reduce ocean temperatures, or at the very least don't let them get warmer, which is probably the easier of those two possibilities. And like I mentioned earlier, we really need to improve our knowledge of ocean biodiversity. So not just studying species better, but also identifying more species to begin with. So there are probably lots of things that we still haven't even found to begin with. And in order to really understand the way that energy and nutrients flow through the system, we're going to need to know more about all the different species are there that might need our help. And this is going to involve documenting demographics and population changes then of these species that we find. And we need to focus on these smaller species that are very poorly studied, like mollusks and seaweeds and echinoderms. And so that's going to mean branching out into some of the stuff that maybe we don't use quite as much. And hopefully we'll also need to protect a larger portion of the world's oceans. So right now only about 1% of all oceans are currently protected, and that is much less than the 12% of land areas that are set aside. So if we do all of these things at once, then hopefully we can make the marine environment a bit safer and have it last for longer and keep our biodiversity safe. And on that note, I am going to wrap up for the week and play Tori Amos singing 1,000 Oceans.